April 5, 1943. 2:15 a.m. The South Pacific was covered in pitch-black darkness. The kind of darkness that swallowed everything, waves, stars, even the moon. In the middle of this endless black, two steel monsters were racing toward each other. Their metal hulls cut through the water, engines roaring, slicing the waves with terrifying speed. One tiny mistake, 1 second of hesitation could mean instant death. The first ship, the USS Onan, was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the most decorated ships in the American fleet. She was built for speed, for firepower, and for survival. Her hull number, 450, gleamed dimly under the moonless sky, a symbol of her legendary luck. Her crew were battle-hardened men who had seen the horrors of Guadalcanal and survived. They knew the ocean was cruel, and they knew that in these waters hesitation meant death. The second vessel was the Ro 34, a Japanese hunter-killer submarine running on the surface. It was a shadow in the black water, moving fast, slicing through the waves like a knife. The Japanese sailors were skilled, trained to strike at night when the Americans could barely see. Their long-lance torpedoes were deadly, their optics sharp, and their nerves of steel. Tonight, they had a chance to catch an American destroyer off guard. The waters around them were known as Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard of ships. By 1943, the Pacific War had turned into a brutal struggle, a dark and grinding fight between steel and fire. The floor of the ocean was littered with the wrecks of more than 50 Allied and Japanese vessels. Each night, sailors lived with the fear that they might join those rusting graves. Every shadow on the water could be a torpedo. Every ripple could hide a mine. Sleep was a luxury, and for the men on the Onan, every second of the night was spent listening, watching, and waiting. On the bridge of the Onan, Commander Donald MacDonald stood with his eyes fixed on the radar screen. He was sharp, calculating, and fearless. His crew spoke in whispers, nerves taut like wires as the radar operator called out blips in the darkness. A contact bearing 2110. Range closing fast. The signal was solid, a metal object moving on the surface. MacDonald narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a friendly submarine. This wasn't a fishing boat. This was something dangerous, moving fast and heading straight for them. Challenge them, MacDonald ordered. The signalman flashed coded lights across the darkness, a warning in a secret language. No response. Challenge again. Silence. The object was coming closer. 1 mile. 800 yards. Soon, the silhouette of the Japanese sub became clear. It was huge, nearly 250 feet long, and moving fast across the black waves. The American sailors stiffened. All their training, all their firepower, it meant nothing if the enemy was too close. Their massive 5-inch guns were designed to fire at targets miles away, or at aircraft high in the sky. At this range, the guns couldn't aim low enough. Torpedoes required distance to arm, and sidearms were tucked away, not ready. The deck crew had nothing in their hands. Nothing. The Japanese sailors were waking too. From the conning tower, they saw a shadow rising from the darkness. A huge American destroyer was right beside them, side by side, almost touching. Their first thought, attack. But their 3-inch deck gun required time to load and aim, and there was no time. Confusion and fear spread quickly. The enemy was too close, and death seemed inevitable. On the Onan, the men froze. Every heart raced. Every breath was sharp in the silent night. Commander MacDonald realized their position. Too close for guns, too close for torpedoes. Too close for anything they were trained to use. And yet, the enemy wasn't panicking. The Japanese crew scrambled, shouting orders, trying to man their weapons, trying to survive. The destroyer and the submarine floated there, almost touching, two massive machines in a deadly standoff. The ocean around them seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the distant lapping of waves and the faint hum of engines. The men knew that in the next few seconds the balance could tip. One move, one wrong turn, one mistake, and either ship could be destroyed in an instant. And then, as the tension reached its peak, something extraordinary happened. Both crews realized they were trapped in a standoff that should have ended in massacre, yet somehow neither could fire. The Onan's guns were useless at this range. The Ro 34 couldn't aim fast enough. And so, in the blackest night of the Pacific, two deadly vessels stared at each other, side by side, each waiting for a chance to strike, or for death to decide their fate. The stage was set. The tension was unbearable. And as the minutes stretched, both crews waited, hearts pounding, knowing that this night would be remembered, though not yet understanding how strange, how unbelievable, and how deadly it would become. In the next moment, history would witness one of the most bizarre and daring acts of World War II. But for now, all anyone could see were two steel monsters face to face in the dark, and the question burning in everyone's mind, How will they survive this deadly night? The Onin and Row 34 were side by side, locked in a deadly dance under the black sky. Neither ship could fire. The massive 5-inch guns of the Onin towered above the Japanese submarine, but at this range they were useless. Too high. Too big. They couldn't aim low enough to hit the enemy just feet away. The deck guns of Row 34 were being manned by confused and frightened sailors, but the time it took to load shells meant they couldn't fire immediately. Every second stretched into an eternity. The men on the Onin's deck could see the Japanese sailors scrambling. They were shouting orders, diving for equipment, trying to prepare their 3-inch deck gun. Panic spread across their faces. And on the American side, a similar panic had taken hold. The deck crew, the cooks, the loaders, the sailors not trained for combat, stood frozen. Their hands were empty. Their weapons were stored below deck. Their hearts raced. Commander McDonald's eyes swept the scene. Every move, every second was a calculation. He knew the danger. A single shell from the Japanese gun could tear through the bridge, kill officers, or destroy the ship's fire control. His guns could not be brought to bear. The destroyer's best weapons were useless at this moment. It seemed impossible. They were trapped in a standoff that could only end in disaster. And then desperation struck. One sailor, looking around frantically, spotted something unusual. Wire bins welded to the side of the ship, filled with crates of Idaho potatoes, brown, hard, ordinary vegetables. They were meant for food, for dinner. Not for fighting. Not for survival. But in that instant, imagination became necessity. One sailor grabbed a potato, lifted it above his head, and threw it toward the enemy submarine. The potato flew through the night, hitting the steel hull of the Row 34 with a dull thud. It was an absurd sound, a laughable moment in any other context, but here it had an extraordinary effect. The Japanese sailors, already startled by the looming destroyer, froze. Their brains, under the stress of darkness and fear, did not recognize the potato. In the chaos, the flying vegetables looked like grenades, small, deadly, and potentially explosive. Another sailor saw the first throw and copied him. And then another. Soon, potatoes were flying from the Onin in all directions. The deck crew, ordinary men with no weapons ready, became a storm of flying food. On Row 34 the Japanese crew panicked. Shouts and orders turned to screams and confusion. Some dove for cover. Others scrambled toward the hatch, thinking they had seconds before a grenade would explode. The deck gun was abandoned. The perfectly trained Japanese sailors were paralyzed by fear, and the fear was real even if the threat was ridiculous. McDonald's heart raced, but he kept his calm. He saw the effect. The potatoes had bought him time. 10, 15 precious seconds. Enough to maneuver, enough to prepare. He gave the order to open distance slowly, keeping the Japanese crew trapped in confusion. The destroyer inched away, engines roaring softly, maintaining the side-by-side position but giving enough room for the guns to be effective once the distance opened. The night air was thick with tension and the smell of salt. Potatoes continued to bounce against the submarine's steel deck. Clangs and thuds echoed, each one amplifying the chaos. The Japanese had never faced anything like this. A destroyer, a million-pound steel monster, was attacking with vegetables. Their training didn't cover this. Their experience hadn't prepared them for such madness. They didn't know what to do. And that was exactly the point. Meanwhile, the men on the Onin felt a strange mix of fear, adrenaline, and disbelief. They were throwing potatoes at a machine that could have destroyed them in seconds. Yet, the impossible was happening. The potatoes were keeping them alive. Ordinary food had become the most effective weapon of the night. The Japanese submarine attempted to recover. Sailors tried to man the deck gun to fire at the Americans. But every time they moved, another potato flew. Every time they lifted a shell, a potato bounced nearby. Panic compounded panic. Confusion became chaos. Commander McDonald saw the opportunity and acted. Engines forward. Rudder hard right. The Onin slid away just enough for her guns to bear on the sub. And then the first 5-inch shells roared into the night. The potato trick had worked. The enemy was distracted, confused, terrified, and now the real attack could begin. High explosive rounds smashed into Row 34's conning tower. Water erupted around the sub. The shockwaves rocked the deck of the Onin, but the crew held firm. The first salvo was enough to tell everyone, the destroyer had regained control. Even though the potatoes were simple vegetables in those few seconds, they had turned the tide. A night that could have ended in instant death had been bought back from the edge of disaster by a handful of spuds. The human instinct to fight, survive, and improvise had created a moment of legend. The Row 34 was hurt but not destroyed. The Japanese crew realized they had underestimated the Americans. The Onin's guns now had line of sight. The stage was set for the real battle to begin. And all of it, for those first terrifying seconds, had been won by potatoes. Ordinary, brown, harmless potatoes. As the night continued, Commander MacDonald knew the fight was far from over. Row 34 would recover and the battle would rage on. But for now, the crew of the Onin had survived one of the strangest, most unbelievable moments in naval history. The impossible had happened, and a story was being written that no one would forget. The potatoes were gone. The silence returned for a brief second. But in that instant, every sailor knew. Sometimes in war, survival depends not on guns or training, but on creativity, courage, and the courage to act when all seems lost. The deadly night had not ended. It had only begun. The night was still heavy over Iron Bottom Sound. The water was black as ink, broken only by the occasional splash of a wave or the dull clang of potatoes bouncing off steel. But the calm was only temporary. Commander MacDonald knew the Japanese submarine, Row 34, was not finished. Hurt, shaken, humiliated by a storm of potatoes, it was still alive, and it was angry. The crew of the Onin had a moment to catch their breath. Hands still trembling, ears ringing from the thud of potatoes hitting metal, hearts pounding like war drums. They had survived a nightmarish standoff. But they also knew the fight had only just begun. Row 34's conning tower had disappeared below the waves for a moment, but sonar picked it up. The sub was moving, surfacing, trying to regain control. MacDonald didn't wait. He barked orders with calm precision. Engines full ahead. Prepare the 5-inch guns. Fire when ready. Every man on the bridge was alert, every sailor on deck at battle stations. The crew had trained for countless scenarios but nothing like this. Yet, adrenaline sharpened their senses. This was the moment training, luck, and courage would collide. The first salvo of the main guns tore through the night. Fire, smoke, and a deafening roar erupted from the barrels. Shells slammed into the Row 34's conning tower. Water erupted like geysers, cascading onto the deck of the Onin. The shockwaves shook the ship. Sailors stumbled, braced against railings, eyes wide with fear and awe. For a few terrifying seconds, silence returned. But this was only a brief pause. The submarine was not destroyed. Its steel hull, though battered, held firm. The Japanese crew scrambled, damaged but alive. They were trained to fight, to survive, and they were not about to give up. The first salvo had warned them, the Americans were deadly, but they still had teeth. MacDonald made another decision. He ordered the Onin to close the distance, to bring its full firepower to bear. The destroyer surged forward like a predator. Its engines roared, cutting the black water. Every sailor knew the stakes. One mistake and the Row 34's deck gun could tear through the bridge, the engines, or worse, into the heart of the ship where officers stood. The Japanese submarine fired back. A shell flew toward the Onin, slicing through the night with a whistle that froze the sailors' blood. It splashed into the water near the hull, sending a spray of seawater high into the air. Close call. Another round, aimed better this time, slammed into the waves just yards away. The Onin shook. The crew pressed themselves against railings, clinging to life. The destroyer had been lucky, but luck could not last forever. MacDonald's mind raced. Firing was dangerous at such a close range. Torpedoes were useless, they needed distance to arm. The guns could only be used if he created space. He barked another order: hold position. Keep them distracted. The crew understood immediately. The strategy wasn't just attack, it was survival. Meanwhile, the deck crew scanned the sub. It was a mess of metal, smoke, and chaos. The Japanese sailors were trying to man their guns, trying to recover from the panic that had begun with a handful of potatoes. In the darkness, with adrenaline in their veins, every movement was desperate, hurried, and dangerous. One wrong step and someone could fall overboard, or worse. Then something extraordinary happened. One sailor on the Onin noticed the sub's deck was slick, damaged, and exposed. He whispered to another, "We can't just wait. Something has to give. We need to act now." The men grabbed whatever they could: wrenches, helmets, anything heavy. But there were no explosives left. No grenades. Just the remains of the potato bins. And then it clicked: what had worked before could work again. A fresh storm of potatoes rained down. Flying, bouncing, clanging against the steel hull of the Japanese sub. The effect was immediate. Screams of fear erupted from Row 34. Sailors dove for cover, thinking more grenades had been thrown. The deck gun was abandoned. Confusion returned, stronger than before. MacDonald seized the moment. Forward. Fire. The 5-inch guns roared again, slamming shells into the sub. Water exploded around it. Metal twisted, hatches bent, and the sub began to list. The first direct hits had broken key systems. Sonar and periscope shears were mangled. The Row 34 was being dismantled piece by piece, unable to fight back effectively. The battle was chaotic, terrifying, and almost surreal. On the Onan, sailors yelled over the roar of engines, guns, and crashing waves. Smoke filled the air. Splashes of water swept over the deck. Each man moved with precision, every step a balance between life and death. Ordinary men, ordinary sailors, were performing extraordinary acts. The Japanese captain realized the danger. His sub was crippled, exposed, and under relentless fire. Any surface maneuver could be fatal. Yet he refused to surrender. In the Imperial Navy, surrender was not an option. He ordered a crash dive, hoping the water itself could save him. But the Onan was ready. Depth charges had been readied during the chaos. The sailors dropped them with deadly precision, sending explosions rippling through the water. Row 34 shuddered under the pressure but still did not sink. It was a steel coffin with teeth. The Japanese crew fought to stabilize it, while the Americans prepared for the final assault. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. The Onan had turned a nearly impossible situation into a fight they could survive, all thanks to courage, strategy, and a few extraordinary seconds bought by a handful of potatoes. And in the middle of the chaos, a lesson became clear. In war, the impossible is often achieved not by the strongest weapon, but by the quickest mind, the bravest heart, and the willingness to act when all seems lost. The night was far from over. The first attack had begun. And both sides knew that the coming hours would decide who lived, and who would be swallowed by the dark, deadly waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The night hung heavy over Iron Bottom Sound. The Onan had survived the first attack, the terrifying standoff, and the chaos of flying potatoes. But Commander MacDonald knew the fight was far from over. The Japanese submarine Row 34 was still alive. Damaged, battered, and scared, yes, but alive. And it was a threat that could strike at any moment. The destroyer's sonar operators were tense. Every ping could mean life or death. The crew on deck clutched railings, their knuckles white. They were exhausted, but adrenaline kept them moving. They knew they had one chance to finish this fight. One chance to end the nightmare. MacDonald looked down at the black water. The submarine's silhouette flickered under the moonless sky, like a shadow refusing to die. Every second the Row 34 stayed afloat was another second of danger. The Japanese sailors had already been terrified by the potato chaos, but now, with the Onan preparing its final strike, panic was about to reach its peak. Prepare depth charges, MacDonald ordered, and bring the main guns to bear. This ends tonight. The sailors worked quickly, efficiently. The depth charges, barrels filled with Torpex explosives, were rolled to the stern. Chains clanged. Water splashed. The crew moved as one, their fear channeled into action. The 5-inch guns were trained on the sub. Targets were calculated. Every sailor knew the danger. One miscalculation and the destroyer itself could be damaged. The Onan inched closer, engines roaring, cutting the black water with terrifying speed. The Row 34 tried to evade, but its damaged hull made it sluggish. Every wave it struck sent water cascading over its deck, revealing its position like a shadow in a nightmare. MacDonald's mind raced. He had to time this perfectly. Too early and the depth charges would miss. Too late and the sub could dive and escape. But there was no hesitation in his orders. He had survived too much to second-guess now. Drop charges, he barked. The barrels plunged into the water with a deafening splash. Seconds later the ocean exploded. Massive geysers of water shot into the sky. The deck of the Onan shook violently, throwing sailors off balance. The explosion rocked the submarine below, rattling its hull, damaging systems, and sending the terrified Japanese crew scrambling for cover. MacDonald didn't stop. He gave the order for the main guns to fire again. The 5-inch shells tore through the night like fire, slamming into the Row 34's conning tower. Steel twisted, hatches bent, and water erupted from every side. The submarine was no longer a threat. It was a battlefield, a broken machine at the mercy of the Onan's relentless assault. The Japanese captain realized the end was near. He gave the order for a crash dive, hoping the water itself could save his men. But the Onan had anticipated this. Another pattern of depth charges hit directly above the sub. Explosions rattled through the hull, crushing it with hydraulic pressure. The Row 34 shuddered violently. Its engine spun erratically. The lights flickered and went out. The destroyer circled above, its crew watching, waiting for the inevitable. The black water was still. Silence fell, then came the evidence of victory. Oil slicks spread across the surface, followed by floating debris, broken equipment, wood, and the shattered remnants of a vessel that had once threatened the Onan. The Row 34 was gone. Destroyed. No survivors. The sailors on the Onan breathed heavily, some kneeling on the deck, clutching their heads, trying to process what had just happened. They had survived the impossible. Ordinary men, ordinary sailors, had destroyed a trained Japanese submarine in the dead of night. And somewhere on the deck, the memory of potatoes lingered, a reminder that courage, quick thinking, and improvisation could turn the tide of war. MacDonald stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the black water. His hands were steady, but inside he felt the weight of what had happened. Every decision had mattered. Every second had counted. And in the end, his crew had prevailed. The Onan had survived the night. Against all odds, against chaos, against death itself. The battle had ended, but the legend had begun. Stories of the potato attack and the final strike would travel fast. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and sailor chatter spread the tale across the Pacific. The Onan wasn't just a ship now. It was a symbol of American courage, ingenuity, and survival. The night faded slowly. Dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink over the endless Pacific. The water, still scarred with oil and debris, reflected the light of the rising sun. For the crew of the Onan, it was a quiet, reflective moment. They had survived. They had won. They had written history. And somewhere in that quiet, a small thought lingered. A reminder of the absurdity and humanity of war. The potatoes. Ordinary vegetables that had bought them precious seconds, turned confusion into survival, and became the most unlikely weapon in naval history. The Onan sailed on, battered but unbroken. The Row 34 lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, a silent, rusted tomb. And for the men on Deck 450, one truth remained clear. In war, courage is measured not only in firepower or strategy, but in the will to act when all hope seems lost. The first battle was over. But the USS Onan, the ship that could not be sunk, had many more battles ahead. The night of April 5, 1943, had ended with the destruction of Row 34, but for the crew of the USS Onan, there was no time to celebrate. In the Pacific, war never paused. Iron Bottom Sound was only the beginning. The Onan, the Lucky O, had survived a near-impossible fight, but the war was far from over. After the potato incident, the destroyer returned to patrol. Every sailor knew the ocean had teeth. The Solomons were a graveyard, a place where metal ships went to die and men went to vanish. Yet the Onan pressed forward. Commander MacDonald understood the stakes. Retreat was not an option. Every mission mattered. Every escort, every patrol, every engagement could tip the balance of the war. By July 1943, the Onan was engaged in the Battle of Kula Gulf. Another night battle, another nightmare in the dark. The Japanese were landing reinforcements under cover of darkness, and American ships intercepted them. The waters were alive with enemy destroyers, their torpedoes slicing silently through the black ocean. The battle was chaotic. Ships collided, shells flew through the air, and explosions lit the night sky. The cruiser USS Helena was hit by 3 torpedoes, breaking its back and sinking within 20 minutes. The Onan was right there, dodging death at every turn. Its guns fired relentlessly, tracking fast-moving targets, while torpedoes screamed past the hull like steel missiles from hell. In the middle of the chaos, MacDonald's crew realized something remarkable. The Onan could survive anything. She moved like a predator, dodging torpedoes, firing her guns, rescuing sailors from sinking ships. The men fought not just for victory but for each other. Every action mattered. Every life counted. The Battle of Vella La Vella in October 1943 brought another test. Japanese forces tried to evacuate troops under the cover of darkness. The Onan led a small force of destroyers to intercept. What followed was close-quarters naval combat like no other. Ships collided in the dark, fire spread across the decks, and chaos reigned. The destroyer USS Shiawalier was hit by a torpedo and lost control, swinging directly into the path of the Onan. A collision was inevitable. Steel screamed against steel. The Onan's bow crumpled, locked with the Shiawalier's hull. Flames and smoke filled the night. But the crew did not panic. They launched boats, boarding the sinking sister ship, pulling wounded sailors from the water and debris. For 20 minutes, they operated in a burning, sinking mess of metal and fire, saving lives while fighting for their own. By now, the Onan's crew had become legends. Ships that would normally rotate out after damage remained on the front lines. Repairs were made quickly, but the destroyer never rested. She pushed forward from the Solomons to the Philippines, always at the tip of the spear. She faced typhoons, suicide attacks, and waves of enemy planes. And somehow, against all odds, she survived. 1944 brought a new terror: kamikaze attacks. The Pacific skies filled with planes designed for death. Pilots who had written their last letters home, flying loaded bombs at American ships. The Onan became a radar picket, stationed miles away from the fleet, alone in the open ocean. Every day felt like a death sentence. Ships around her were being destroyed, torn apart by waves of suicide planes. On one terrifying morning, a squadron of kamikazes approached from 3 angles. The Onan's gunners, the best in the fleet, tracked each target with deadly precision. The first plane exploded in midair, a ball of fire harmlessly crashing into the ocean. Another clipped the water, skidding across the waves, exploding just 50 yards from the hull. The third plane came straight down, its engine screaming. The bridge crew watched in horror as it fell toward them. But the Onan refused to die. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers. The destroyer twisted and turned, engines screaming, guns blazing. The plane hit the water just off the starboard bow. Flames and water sprayed over the deck. The ship was shaken but not broken. Every sailor realized it again. They were witnessing something extraordinary. The Lucky O was not just a ship, it was alive in a way that defied logic. Even through the exhaustion, the fear, and the chaos, the crew continued to fight. They had learned that survival was not just about firepower or strategy, it was about discipline, courage, and refusing to give up even when death was inches away. And the Onan seemed to understand that too. Through every engagement, every storm, every kamikaze attack, she survived where other ships would have been destroyed. By the time 1945 arrived, the Onan had become one of the most decorated ships in the Pacific. Battle stars, citations, and medals lined her record, but for the crew, it was never about glory. It was about living to see the next sunrise, pulling each other from danger and carrying on. They had survived the impossible once with potatoes, and they would survive again and again. Through all of this, the men of Deck 450 never forgot what had saved them in the darkest night of April 5, 1943. Not just skill, not just training, but courage, improvisation, and the small acts of bravery that turned panic into victory. The potatoes had become a symbol, a reminder that even in the worst situations, a single brave action could change everything. And so the Onan sailed on, through the chaos, the storms, and the enemy's fury, always forward, always surviving, a living legend of the Pacific War. By 1945, the USS Onan had become a name whispered across the Pacific, a destroyer that refused to sink, a ship that carried the luck of its crew and the courage of every sailor on board. But even legends are tested. The final battles of the Pacific would push the Lucky O and her men to the absolute edge of survival. The campaign for Okinawa was underway. The island was crucial, a stepping stone to the Japanese mainland. And the cost of taking it would be unimaginably high. The Japanese had prepared a last, desperate defense. Thousands of soldiers, suicide boats, human torpedoes, and kamikaze pilots ready to dive into any ship that dared to approach. The Onan was assigned to the radar picket line, essentially a floating early warning station. It was the most dangerous job in the Navy. Alone, miles ahead of the main fleet, the Onan would spot incoming aircraft first. And being first meant being first to die. The sailors checked life jackets, rafts, and ammunition. The decks were silent for a moment, a tense pause before the storm. They remembered the night of the potatoes, the Row 34, and all the battles that had brought them here. And then the horizon darkened, not with clouds but with the silhouettes of incoming planes. The kamikazes came in waves, screaming like death incarnate. The first planes were spotted at a distance, and the Onan's gunners opened fire immediately. The 5-inch guns roared, their shells cutting the night sky, tracing arcs of fire toward the approaching enemy. Smoke and tracer rounds lit the ocean like fireworks over a battlefield. But for every plane destroyed, another came hurtling closer. The sailors moved like clockwork. The anti-aircraft gunners on the 40mm and 20mm cannons fired in synchronized bursts, cutting paths of destruction through the enemy squadron. Explosions rocked the ship as planes crashed into the water just yards away, sending plumes of fire and water across the deck. Each missed plane was a second closer to disaster. One kamikaze broke through. Its engine screamed. The men on deck froze for a heartbeat. Time slowed. The plane dove directly at the bridge, aiming for the heart of the ship. Commander MacDonald barked orders, and the Onan twisted violently, engines at maximum power. The plane struck the water just off the starboard bow, exploding in a column of fire and water. The deck shuddered, but the destroyer survived. Again. 4 hours the attacks continued. The radar picket line was a slaughterhouse. Every destroyer around them had been hit or sunk. Ships burned, crews screamed, and chaos raged across the ocean. But the Onan held her course. Every sailor on board knew the unthinkable. They were living through history. They were part of a ship that seemed blessed, or cursed, to survive when so many others perished. The Onan's gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Decks were littered with spent shells, oil, and water from near misses. Every man on board was exhausted, yet none faltered. Each wave of kamikazes was a test of courage, precision, and sheer willpower. And every wave they survived became another story to tell, another piece of the legend that was now inseparable from the destroyer herself. After days of relentless attacks, the battle began to wind down. The kamikaze pilots had been driven off or destroyed. The main fleet was safe for the moment, and the Onan, though battered, had survived again. Commander MacDonald looked over the deck at his exhausted crew, men who had stared death in the face countless times. Their faces were lined with fatigue, sweat, and the remnants of terror, but also relief, pride, and the quiet satisfaction of survival. By August 1945, the war in the Pacific was coming to an end. The atomic bombs had been dropped. Japan had surrendered. The men of the Onan could finally breathe, though their memories were heavy with all they had seen. They had survived the bloodiest waters on Earth, fought against the most skilled and desperate enemies, and endured horrors that most would never imagine. When the USS Onan sailed into Tokyo Bay for the formal surrender of Japan, she was dwarfed by the massive battleships alongside her, the Missouri, the Iowa, but she drew every eye. Sailors, officers, and photographers all knew the truth. This was no ordinary ship. She was the destroyer that had survived kamikazes, typhoons, collisions, and the strangest night of the war when a crate of potatoes had helped defeat a submarine. She was the Lucky O, a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and sheer survival. The story of the potato attack, the Row 34, and the final battle spread quickly. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and sailor tales immortalized the crew and their ship. They had become legends not because they were invincible, but because they refused to give up when everything was against them. Courage, quick thinking, and unshakable determination had turned ordinary sailors into heroes. The USS Onan continued to serve after the war, a living reminder of what ordinary men could accomplish under extraordinary circumstances. She fought in Korea, Vietnam, and finally retired in 1970. Her steel hull eventually sold for scrap, but her legacy would never die. The men who survived her battles carried the story with them, telling their children, grandchildren, and the world about the ship that could not be sunk. In the end, the Onan taught a lesson that went beyond military strategy or war stories. She showed that in the darkest night, when the odds are impossible, human courage and ingenuity can create miracles. Whether it was potatoes on a dark ocean night or dodging a kamikaze at Okinawa, survival was possible for those who refused to quit. The Pacific had claimed millions, but the Onan and her crew had survived. And in surviving they became legends. The war had ended. The Pacific Ocean, once a battlefield of fire, steel, and death, had finally fallen silent. The bombs had stopped. The guns were quiet. The screams of men lost in the waves had faded into memory. But for the crew of the USS Onan, silence brought something heavier, reflection. They had survived the unthinkable. From the night they had thrown potatoes at Row 34, buying themselves seconds of life, to dodging the suicide dives of kamikaze pilots at Okinawa, to rescuing fellow sailors from burning, sinking ships, they had faced death in countless forms. Every battle had left scars, on the hull, on the ship, and in their minds. And yet they had endured. The Onan herself bore the marks of a life spent in combat. Her hull was dented and scarred, paint faded from endless exposure to sun, salt, and fire. The bow that had crushed alongside the Shiawalier was patched and welded, a testament to human ingenuity and determination. Every battle star, every medal, every scratch and burn on her deck told a story. But it was the human stories, the fear, the courage, the camaraderie, that made the Onan a legend. On quiet days in port, the crew would walk along the deck and remember. They remembered April 5, 1943, and the strange, desperate courage that had turned a crate of potatoes into a weapon. They remembered the nights in the Solomons when shadows on the water could mean death, and every splash could signal a torpedo. They remembered the hellish fires, the crashing steel, and the smell of oil and salt and smoke. And yet there was laughter too. Sometimes, when the deck was calm and the sun was setting, The sailors would point to the spud lockers and joke about the night they had fought a submarine with vegetables. It was absurd, but it was also truth. The story of the potatoes became more than legend. It became a reminder that even in war humanity finds strange heroic ways to survive. The USS Onan continued to sail long after World War II ended. She fought in the Korean War, standing as a shield for American forces under fire. She served in Vietnam, navigating treacherous waters and hostile skies. She was decommissioned in 1970, her steel hull sold for scrap, her engines silenced forever. But though the ship was gone, her stories remained alive. Veterans of the Onan carried her legacy in their hearts. They told their children, grandchildren, and friends about nights in the dark Pacific, about courage under fire, about survival against impossible odds. They spoke not of glory or fame, but of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. They spoke of teamwork, quick thinking, and the quiet, stubborn will to live. In museums, history books, and naval archives, the Onan's name lives on. But it is not just the battles, the medals, or the Lucky O nickname that makes her remarkable. It is the human spirit she carried across the oceans. She represents the ordinary men who, when faced with terror and death, acted with courage, creativity, and unbreakable resolve. She represents the moments when hope and bravery turn the tide, when one action, one potato thrown, one evasive maneuver, one calculated shot, made the difference between life and death. Today the Row 34 rests at the bottom of the Pacific, a rusted tomb in dark water. The men who threw the potatoes, who faced death on deck, who survived storms, fire, and kamikaze dives, have mostly passed on. Some rest in Arlington, others in small towns across America. But their courage echoes across time, and their story teaches something timeless. War may destroy bodies, but courage, ingenuity, and determination can immortalize the spirit. The USS Onan reminds us that history is not written in steel alone. It is written in the eyes of those who stared death in the face and refused to blink. It is written in the hands of sailors who acted when every option seemed impossible. It is written in the laughter that follows fear, the bravery that follows panic, and the humanity that shines through in the darkest nights. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. Not the medals, not the battle stars, not the hull numbers, but the reminder that ordinary men, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can achieve the impossible. That even a crate of potatoes can change history. That courage, ingenuity, and the will to survive are more powerful than any weapon. The USS Onan may no longer sail the seas, but she sails in memory. She sails in stories, in history, in the hearts of those who believe that even in the darkest night, there is hope. And in that hope, the legend of the Lucky O lives on, forever a symbol of human courage, resilience, and the incredible will to survive.